My name is Harper, and I am 32 years old. For years, I lived quietly in a decaying apartment building, keeping my head down, while the landlord's son treated the tenants like dirt on his designer shoes. He looked at my worn jacket and mocked my bank account in front of my own family. What he did not know was that I evaluate commercial mergers and acquisitions for one of the largest private equity firms in the country. He joked that I would never own a piece of real estate. 2 years later, his fraudulent startup signed a lease for a premium penthouse office. He did not bother checking the true ownership of the holding company. He handed the keys to his empire directly to me. Before I explain how I legally dismantled his entire life and took everything my sister valued, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe arrogance is just a debt waiting to be collected. The smell of charred ribs hung thick in the humid evening air. I stood cornered against the brick parapet of the rooftop. Julian Sterling took a slow sip of his craft beer, his Italian loafers planted firmly on the cracked concrete. He pointed his bottle at my faded coat, making sure his voice carried over the chatter of the gathered tenants. "Some people just cannot afford better," he sneered. He turned to his audience, flashing a pristine, expensive smile. "She actually withheld rent last month to force my father to fix a radiator. It is pathetic, really. Begging for heat like a stray dog." My sister Vanessa stood beside him, swirling a glass of rose. She rolled her eyes, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment at my presence. Next to her was her husband Marcus. He adjusted the cuffs of his sharp navy suit, eager to impress the landlord's son. Marcus was an African-American commercial real estate broker, and Julian was his golden goose. "Do not waste your breath on her, Julian," Marcus chuckled, clapping the air on the shoulder. "Let us toast to the new headquarters. To Oratech." I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my right to basic heating in a building that violated city code. Panic and anger are useless emotions. I kept my face perfectly neutral, letting my gaze drift to the glass patio table. Marcus had carelessly tossed his leather briefcase there. The flap hung open, exposing a glossy marketing prospectus. The bold letters across the top read, "Apex Tower Penthouse Lease Proposal." It was the crown jewel of the downtown commercial district, the exact location Julian wanted for his tech startup. I shifted my weight, pulling my phone from my pocket. Under the guise of checking a text message, I zoomed the camera lens on the small print at the bottom of the prospectus page. I read the name of the primary debt holder for Apex Tower. A cold, sharp focus settled into my chest. Julian was busy mocking my bank account, and Marcus was busy selling out his own sister-in-law for a commission check. Neither of the arrogant men realized that I spent my days analyzing distressed commercial assets, and the fund I worked for was the primary lender holding the debt on Apex Tower. Julian was desperate to sign a lease in a building my firm effectively controlled. The trap was already laid out right in front of me. I just needed to buy the cage. The rusted hinges of my apartment door whined as I pushed it shut, locking out the noise of the rooftop barbecue. The air inside my living room was thick with a damp chill seeping through poorly insulated window frames. Julian Sterling loved to neglect standard maintenance, but his negligence provided the perfect cover for my actual life. I did not waste a single second dwelling on his cruel jokes or my sister spilling her disdain into a wine glass. I dropped my faded coat onto a chair and walked straight to my desk. I hit a switch, and 3 high-resolution monitors flared to life, casting a pale blue glow across the peeling wallpaper. My work at the private equity firm required dissecting corporate carcasses. I stripped away marketing illusions to find the raw, rotting numbers underneath. I was a predator in the mergers and acquisitions space, and tonight Julian was the prey in my crosshairs. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, producing a rapid staccato rhythm in the quiet room. I bypassed the standard public search engines and logged into a proprietary financial terminal. Oratech was the darling of the local tech blogs, boasting a staggering valuation built entirely on buzzwords and inherited social connections. I wanted to see the blood flowing through the veins of his startup. I pulled the corporate filings and cross-referenced them with offshore server data I routinely used for distressed asset evaluation. The truth emerged in stark, unyielding columns of digital ink. Oratech was a hollow shell. The revenue streams were practically non-existent, padded by phantom user metrics and circular investments. Julian was burning through seed capital on expensive dinners, luxury car leases, and bloated marketing campaigns designed to create an aura of success. The actual cash reserves were dangerously near zero. He was projecting the image of a tech visionary while steering a sinking ship straight toward a financial iceberg. A company with zero liquidity cannot secure a premium lease in a premier location like Apex Tower. The commercial real estate market relies on ruthless vetting and unforgiving background checks. I opened a secondary terminal and tapped into the digital registry of the local broker network. Marcus was eager to climb the social ladder, and his digital security hygiene was laughable. I intercepted the data packets carrying the lease application he was preparing for the Apex Tower Management Board. The application was a masterpiece of fiction. Marcus was actively cooking the books. He had inflated the projected quarterly earnings of Oratech by a factor of 10. He forged letters of intent from phantom software investors to create an illusion of robust future cash flow. He was risking his professional broker license and facing potential prison time to push this deal across the finish line, all to secure a staggering six-figure commission check. He wanted to buy his way into the elite circles he worshipped, and Julian was his ticket. The audacity was impressive, but the financial architecture was highly unstable. Even with forged revenue projections, a premier commercial landlord requires a solid safety net. A lease of that magnitude demands a guarantor holding substantial liquid assets. I scrolled down to the collateral section of the application, expecting to see Richard Sterling listed as the financial backer. But the elder Sterling was a calculating operator who never risked his own capital on his son's vanity projects. The name listed on the guarantee clause made the air evaporate from my lungs. The digital text stared back at me, displaying a familiar residential address and a specific routing number. It was my mother. Marcus had dug his greedy hands into his own family. My mother was a retired public school teacher living on a modest pension and a carefully managed retirement fund. Marcus had manipulated her. He either coerced her into signing the guarantee under the guise of a safe family investment, or he forged her signature outright using documents from a past tax return. He anchored her life savings as the hidden collateral to absorb the risk of Julian signing the lease. If Oratech failed and Julian defaulted on the rent, the landlord would legally seize my mother's retirement accounts, leaving her entirely destitute in her old age. My own brother-in-law sold out my mother to buy his way into Julian's good graces. A cold, calculating fury replaced the rhythm of my pulse. Contacting the authorities would trigger a prolonged bureaucratic nightmare. Fraud investigations take months and require mountains of subpoenas. In the meantime, the lease would proceed, and my mother's assets would remain frozen in a legal limbo, subjected to court battles. I needed a surgical strike to neutralize the threat and seize control of the battlefield. I picked up my encrypted phone and dialed the direct line of my managing director at the equity firm. The clock read past midnight, but in the world of high-stakes acquisitions, time is an irrelevant concept. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and alert. I bypassed the pleasantries and pitched the acquisition. I detailed a strategy to buy out the distressed debt portfolio holding Apex Tower and transfer the primary deed to a shell corporation I registered the previous year. I mapped out the capitalization rates and projected a turnaround strategy using the pending commercial leases to stabilize the asset. I wanted to be the landlord holding the leash when Marcus submitted that fraudulent application. The director pulled up the market data on his end. The line went silent for a long, tense minute while he processed the analytics. He finally exhaled a harsh breath into the receiver. "The metrics do not align, Harper," he stated flatly. "The commercial sector is facing a severe downturn, and Apex Tower has a precarious vacancy rate. The debt service coverage ratio is bleeding. The firm is not deploying institutional capital into a volatile asset just so you can play out a personal vendetta. The risk matrix is too steep. The board will reject the proposal by dawn." He severed the connection, leaving a dial tone echoing in the quiet room. The rejection hit hard, forming a concrete wall in my path. I stared at the blinking cursor on my middle screen. The system required an owner to approve the lease and trap the broker. If my firm refused to buy the building, I had to step into the void myself. I opened my personal financial portfolio. For years, I lived in squalor, hoarding every bonus, every stock dividend, and every successful trade. I accumulated a formidable quiet fortune, while Julian laughed at my cheap clothes and my sister mocked my lifestyle. I executed a sequence of high-risk wire transfers, liquidating my diversified investments in a matter of minutes. I consolidated my entire net worth into a single holding account. It was not enough to buy the tower outright. I navigated to a shadow lending portal favored by aggressive institutional investors and applied for a mezzanine loan. This specific financial instrument bypassed standard banking regulations, offering immediate capital in exchange for lethal interest rates and brutal collateral requirements. I listed my own financial future as the guarantee. I signed a contract that would leave me in insurmountable debt, forcing me into immediate bankruptcy if the tower failed to generate revenue. I pushed the final authorization through the portal, staking my very existence on a razor-thin margin. I had exactly 48 hours to close the acquisition, finalize the deed transfer, and assume total ownership of Apex Tower before Marcus officially filed the forged lease documents. The countdown started, and my finger hovered over the trigger. The digital wire transfer cleared at exactly 8 in the morning. My banking dashboard flashed green, finalizing the staggering debt assumption. I traded my financial safety for weaponized leverage. The shell company I controlled now held the primary deed to Apex Tower. I was the invisible force commanding 70 stories of prime downtown real estate. I did not celebrate. I brewed a cup of black coffee and linked my home terminal to the building administration network. The transition was seamless. The previous management handed over the digital keys, including the master access to the internal surveillance grid. I sat in my cold apartment wearing a faded sweater while holding the reins of a multi-million-dollar commercial asset. I routed the Penthouse security feeds to my primary monitor. The high-definition cameras offered a pristine view of the sweeping raw commercial space overlooking the city skyline. The elevator doors slid open, revealing Marcus and Julian. They strutted onto the concrete floor, echoing with entitlement. Julian wore a tailored linen blazer, his hands resting on his hips as he surveyed the expansive room. He sneered at the layout. He pointed a manicured finger at a thick concrete pillar, demanding its removal to create an open-concept aesthetic. He possessed zero understanding of architectural engineering. That pillar was a structural load-bearing support. Tearing it down would compromise the entire floor. Marcus trailed behind him, holding a leather portfolio, nodding eagerly. Marcus built his career kissing the rings of generational wealth, always eager to please the elite, regardless of the collateral damage. He assured Julian that the new anonymous corporate owners could be bought off. He promised to bribe the management board to approve the dangerous renovations. They laughed, a hollow, echoing sound inside the vacant suite, entirely blind to the predator watching them through the glass lens mounted in the ceiling corner. Marcus was desperate for this deal. He drove a leased sports car and wore luxury suits bought on credit, maintaining a facade of success while drowning in hidden debt. He needed Julian to sign this contract to secure a commission check that would keep his own creditors at bay. I minimized the video feed and opened the legal drafting software. Standard commercial leases are negotiated over weeks. They involve armies of attorneys fighting over liability caps and exit clauses. I bypassed the standard protocol. I engineered a lease agreement that functioned as a legal bear trap. The document contained highly toxic stipulations rarely seen in straightforward corporate rentals. I embedded a cross-collateralization clause. This specific provision meant that any default on the rent would allow the landlord to seize not just the company assets, but the personal holdings of the guarantors. I followed it with a zero-tolerance eviction mandate, triggered the moment any financial misrepresentation was discovered in the application. Since I already knew Marcus forged the revenue projections, this clause gave me the power to lock them out on day one. I exported the file into a sterile, encrypted format, stripping away my personal identity and masking the sender as a generic legal compliance portal. I routed the email directly to Marcus. The timeline was my greatest ally. Julian was hosting a highly publicized launch event for Oratech next week. He had invited prominent venture capitalists from Silicon Valley and promised them a grand unveiling at his new downtown headquarters. He needed a signed lease to validate his fake valuation. Through the camera feed, I watched Marcus check his phone. He alerted Julian that the contract had arrived. Julian sighed in annoyance. He complained about the tedious legal jargon and the slow pace of his own retained counsel. Arrogance is a blinding condition. Julian believed he was untouchable, a visionary who operated above the mundane rules of commerce. He snatched the digital tablet from his broker. He did not read the terms. He did not scroll down to inspect the name of the holding company listed as the lessor. He simply dragged his stylus across the screen, executing a binding digital signature with a careless flick of his wrist. He handed the device back, expecting immediate access to his new kingdom. I watched the incoming data packet hit my server. The signature was verified, but the automated underwriting protocol I designed instantly halted the final execution. The system generated a glaring red error code and pushed the notification back to the broker tablet in the Penthouse. Auratech lacked the verified liquidity to stand on its own. The algorithm demanded a third-party personal guarantor possessing a verified net worth of at least $5 million. Julian stared at the tablet screen, his pristine smile faltering. He lacked the personal capital. His father, Richard, kept his own fortune locked behind impenetrable trusts, deliberately starving his son of liquid assets to teach him harsh business lessons. Julian turned slowly toward Marcus. The dynamic in the Penthouse shifted from collaborative celebration to predatory desperation. Julian reminded his broker about the lucrative commission resting on this single deal. He cornered the man who had just sold out my mother, demanding that Marcus step up and put his own neck on the legal chopping block to secure the lease. Marcus wiped a sudden layer of sweat from his forehead, trapped between losing his golden ticket and risking his own financial survival. He was staring down a fiscal precipice. To save the deal, Marcus would have to find a guarantor willing to risk everything on a hollow startup. The walls were closing in on them, and the only exit led straight into my snare. The clinking of silver forks against faux bone china echoed through my sister's dining room. Vanessa hosted these weekly family dinners to showcase her perceived upward mobility. Her house was a monument to leverage. Every piece of furniture, every piece of abstract art hanging on the walls, and the luxury sedan parked in the driveway were financed to the hilt. She lived in a constant state of financial peril, masked by expensive perfume and forced smiles. I sat at the end of the long table wearing my usual plain gray sweater, pushing dry roasted vegetables around my plate. Marcus sat at the head of the table. He was sweating. The air conditioning was running full blast, but small beads of moisture gathered at his temples. He kept checking his phone, his thumb hovering over the dark screen. He had spent the last 8 hours scrambling to find a guarantor for Julian Sterling's penthouse lease. The commercial real estate market is unforgiving. No sane investor was going to back a hollow-tech startup lacking verifiable revenue. Marcus was running out of time, and his desperation brought him right back to his own dining room table. He poured Vanessa another generous glass of imported red wine. He cleared his throat, adopting the slick, polished cadence he used on his naive clients. He did not pitch the guarantor signature as a lethal financial liability. He spun it into an exclusive opportunity. He told Vanessa that Julian needed a silent partner to push the Apex Tower deal across the finish line. He promised her that by anchoring the lease, they would secure backdoor equity in Auratech. He painted a vivid picture of Silicon Valley buyouts, private jets, and summer homes in the Hamptons. Vanessa leaned forward, her eyes widening with raw, unrestrained greed. She swallowed the lie without chewing. She spent her entire life trying to claw her way into the elite circles that always kept her on the perimeter. The idea of being business partners with a Sterling intoxicated her. She began talking about upgrading their country club membership and hiring a private interior decorator for the new mansion she assumed they would soon afford. She did not ask to read the terms. She did not inquire about the monthly rent burden. Her ego blinded her to the very real danger lurking beneath her husband's desperate pitch. I placed my fork down. The metal handle clattered against the plate, silencing her ongoing monologue about luxury car brands. I looked directly at Marcus, watching the muscles in his jaw tighten. If you sign as a personal guarantor on a commercial lease of that magnitude, you are assuming total default risk, I stated, keeping my voice clinical and flat. If Auratech misses a single payment, the landlord will bypass the corporate shell and seize your personal assets. They will take this house. They will garnish your broker commissions. You are volunteering for bankruptcy. The dining room fell dead silent. Marcus glared at me, a flash of pure hatred crossing his features. I had just introduced logic into a room fueled by fantasy. Vanessa turned her head, her neck snapping toward me. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly resentment. She hated my practical nature. She despised the fact that I never played into her superficial games. Her hand shot forward, gripping the stem of her wine glass. With a swift, reckless motion, she hurled the contents directly at me. The dark red liquid splashed across my chest, soaking into the fabric of my gray sweater. The cold wine seeped through to my skin. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or scramble for a napkin. I just sat perfectly still, watching the crimson drops fall from my collar onto the edge of the dining table. "You are just jealous," Vanessa hissed, her voice trembling with venom. "You sit there in your cheap clothes, acting like you know how the world works. You are a failure, Harper. I am about to secure a fortune and buy a real estate portfolio while you are stuck paying rent to the Sterling family in a decaying shoebox. You are a broke tenant who will never amount to anything. Keep your pathetic advice to yourself." Marcus smirked, crossing his arms. He let his wife do the dirty work. He watched me sit there drenched in wine and offered no apology. That was the exact moment the final thread tying me to my family snapped cleanly in two. I wiped a drop of wine from my chin. I stood up, pushing my chair back. I did not say a word. I turned my back on their toxic dinner and walked out the front door, leaving them to their delusions. I drove back to my apartment, the damp fabric clinging to my skin, serving as a cold reminder of why I needed to execute my plan flawlessly. I unlocked my door and went straight to my workstation. I did not bother changing my ruined clothes. I woke my monitors and logged into the secure Landlord portal for Apex Tower. I watched the inbound traffic queue, monitoring the digital pipeline for the incoming lease application. It arrived at exactly 11 at night. Marcus had uploaded the final documentation. I opened the file and initiated an immediate background verification. The system parsed the data, extracting the guarantor details. Marcus had convinced Vanessa to sign, but their combined legitimate net worth barely cracked $1 million, mostly tied up in the heavily leveraged house. The algorithmic threshold I had set required $5 million in liquid or tangible assets. I scrolled to the financial addendum attached to the application. Marcus had done exactly what I predicted a cornered, desperate man would do. He committed a severe federal crime. He had uploaded a fraudulent property appraisal, artificially inflating the value of his residential home by 300%. He then attached a fabricated investment portfolio statement linking Vanessa to phantom mutual funds that did not exist. He committed wire fraud and bank fraud in a single PDF upload just to secure his commission check and appease Julian. He handed me the rope, the chair, and the execution order. The Landlord portal displayed a blinking yellow prompt awaiting my manual override to finalize the contract. The terms were draconian. The cross-collateralization clause was locked in place, binding Marcus and Vanessa to Julian's inevitable failure. The immediate eviction mandate was active, ready to be triggered the second I chose to expose the fake appraisal. I rested my hand on the computer mouse. I looked at the red wine stain drying on my chest. I thought about my mother, whose retirement fund Marcus had tried to steal just days prior. I thought about Vanessa prioritizing the illusion of wealth over her own sister. I clicked accept. The screen flashed green, the digital signatures encrypted and locked. The lease became a binding legal weapon. The trap snapped shut with a silent, definitive echo across the network. Julian, Sterling, Marcus, and Vanessa were now legally bound to my shell corporation. They owed me millions of dollars in future rent backed by fraudulent collateral. They were dancing on a trapdoor, and I held the only lever. I leaned back in my chair, letting the cold reality of the victory settle into my bones. The silence of my apartment was abruptly broken by the sharp buzz of my personal cell phone resting on the desk. I picked up the device. A text message illuminated the screen. The sender was Julian Sterling. He had no idea he was now my tenant. He just wanted to exert power over the only person he viewed as beneath him. "My dad reviewed the building ledger," he wrote. "He decided your rent is going up by 30% starting next week. Pay up or pack up. Good luck affording it, you broke loser." I read the text twice. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. Julian thought he was squeezing a helpless tenant for extra cash to fund his lavish lifestyle. He was about to find out that the woman he was trying to evict now owned the very ground he planned to build his fake empire upon. The game had shifted, and his grand opening gala next week was going to be the perfect stage for a slaughter. 2 years crept by with agonizing slowness. Building an airtight legal guillotine requires patience. Julian Sterling spent those 24 months burning through seed capital. He threw lavish parties, purchased sponsored articles in tech magazines, and flooded social media with highly edited videos showcasing his luxurious penthouse headquarters. He lived exactly like the billionaire he desperately wanted to be, while his actual product, a predictive data analytics software, remained a glitchy, unstable mess. Marcus continued to feed off the scraps, acting as Julian's personal fixer and hype man. Vanessa parroted around town, swiping high-limit credit cards, firmly believing her husband had secured their place in the elite stratosphere. They lived in a glittering soap bubble. My job was to hold the needle. The night of the Oratech grand launch finally arrived. The event was held on the top floor of Apex Tower, a space Julian proudly called his own. The penthouse was transformed into an opulent club. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning panoramic view of the glittering city skyline. Waiters in crisp black uniforms circulated with silver trays, offering vintage champagne and imported caviar. The room was packed with venture capitalists, angel investors, and influential tech journalists. Julian needed a massive injection of Series A funding to keep his company afloat. Tonight was his ultimate sales pitch. I slipped into the venue through the service elevator, avoiding the red carpet entrance. I wore a simple clearance rack dress, blending perfectly into the background. I was officially on the guest list, merely categorized as the +1 of the primary broker. Marcus had reluctantly added my name, assuming I would stay hidden in the corner eating free appetizers, while he hobnobbed with the elite. He was busy standing near the ice sculpture, laughing loudly at a joke made by a prominent venture capitalist. Julian stood on a raised, illuminated platform in the center of the room. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo, looking every inch the Silicon Valley prodigy. He held a sleek microphone, captivating the audience with a rehearsed speech full of disruptive buzzwords and impossible revenue projections. He painted a future where Oratech software would revolutionize global finance. The investors nodded, taking notes on their tablets, eager to buy into the illusion. I leaned against a marble pillar near the back, watching the performance. My presence was a deliberate anomaly in a room full of designer gowns and expensive cologne. Julian finished a dramatic pause in his speech, allowing the applause to wash over him. His eyes swept across the crowd, soaking in the admiration. Then his gaze snagged on me. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The arrogant facade cracked, replaced by a flash of genuine annoyance. He lowered the microphone and whispered something to his lead security guard, a burly man wearing an earpiece. The guard nodded, his eyes locking onto my position. He began weaving aggressively through the crowd of investors, moving with clear intent to physically remove me from the premises. Julian was not going to let the broke tenant ruin his perfect aesthetic. The guard stopped 2 feet away from me, folding his massive arms across his chest. "You need to leave," he stated, his voice a low, threatening rumble. "Mr. Sterling requested your immediate departure. You are trespassing on private corporate property." I did not step back. I did not raise my voice to cause a scene. I reached into my small clutch purse and retrieved a thick red envelope sealed with heavy wax. I held it out toward the guard. "I am not trespassing," I replied, my tone perfectly level. "I am executing a legally mandated delivery. Hand this directly to Mr. Sterling. Tell him it requires his immediate attention before the ribbon-cutting ceremony." The guard frowned, looking down at the stark red envelope. He hesitated, unsure if he should grab my arm or take the package. My unbothered demeanor confused his basic protocols. He snatched the envelope from my hand and turned back toward the stage. I watched Julian snatch the envelope from the guard, irritated by the interruption. He broke the wax seal and pulled out the single sheet of premium paper inside. It was not a congratulatory note. It was a formal notice of default. Julian stared at the bold legal header. His face lost its color. Oratech was bleeding cash so rapidly that he had missed his massive monthly rent payment by exactly 24 hours. He assumed he could charm the anonymous landlord into a grace period. The document in his hands explicitly stated that no grace period would be granted, and structural penalties were actively being enforced. Julian crushed the paper in his fist, shoving it into his tuxedo pocket. He forced a smile back onto his face, turning his attention back to the crowd. He refused to let a minor administrative warning derail his night. He gestured toward a massive digital display screen spanning the entire back wall of the penthouse. "Now let us demonstrate the raw power of the Oratech predictive engine," Julian announced, projecting false confidence. He signaled his lead engineer, a nervous-looking man, hunched over a master console near the stage. The engineer typed a sequence of commands to initiate the live software demonstration. The investors leaned forward, watching the giant screen expectantly. They were promised a flawless real-time data rendering. The screen flickered. The sleek corporate logo vanished, replaced by a harsh spinning buffering icon. The progress bar froze at 5%. A heavy, awkward silence descended over the room. The venture capitalists exchanged confused glances. Julian maintained his rigid smile, urging the engineer to hurry up. "Just a minor local network lag." Julian chuckled nervously, trying to diffuse the tension. "Our servers are handling an immense data load tonight." The engineer was sweating profusely, his fingers flying frantically across the keyboard. He pulled up the network diagnostic terminal. "Sir?" The engineer stammered, his voice carrying over the quiet room. "We are completely locked out. The primary fiber optic pipeline servicing this floor has been throttled to near zero. We cannot access our cloud servers or retrieve the demonstration data. The system is essentially dead." Julian dropped the microphone. It hit the stage with a loud screeching thud of feedback. He marched over to the console, shoving the engineer aside and pounding aggressively on the keyboard. He cursed loudly, his polished tech visionary persona shattering completely in front of the exact people he needed to impress. He demanded his team bypass the firewall. He screamed at them to fix the connection. He had absolutely no idea that the connectivity issue was not a technical glitch. It was a targeted structural penalty. When I acquired Apex Tower 2 years ago, I integrated a remote access protocol into the building administration software. I controlled the core utilities, the HVAC systems, and the primary internet trunks servicing every floor. As the legal owner executing a default penalty, I had just manually choked the bandwidth to the penthouse suite down to dial-up speeds. A prominent venture capitalist, a man known for his ruthless investing strategy, stepped away from the crowd. He approached the stage, his face a mask of deep disappointment. "If your revolutionary software cannot even maintain a basic local connection during a controlled demonstration, how do you expect us to trust it with global financial data?" he asked, his voice cutting through Julian's frantic yelling. "This is amateur hour, Julian. We are done here." The investor turned his back and walked toward the exit. The domino effect was immediate. The other financiers, realizing they were watching a sinking ship, began murmuring quietly among themselves and moving toward the elevators. The grand launch was disintegrating into a public relations disaster. Marcus rushed to the stage, grabbing Julian by the arm, trying to calm him down and salvage the night. Julian shoved him away violently, his face purple with rage. He looked across the chaotic room, searching for someone to blame. His eyes locked onto me, still standing calmly by the marble pillar. He remembered the red envelope. He finally realized the broke tenant from his father's dilapidated building was not just a helpless bystander. The doors of the main conference room, located adjacent to the stage, suddenly swung open, revealing a new, uninvited guest, ready to escalate the nightmare from a technical failure to an absolute legal massacre. The spectacular failure of the launch gala sent shockwaves through the local tech sector. Julian Sterling spent the entire night frantically calling investors, begging for a second chance to prove his software was viable. The venture capitalists demanded a formal explanation. They agreed to a closed-door emergency meeting the following morning, setting a strict ultimatum. If Julian could not produce verified financial records and a stable working prototype, they would formally withdraw their letters of intent, effectively starving Oratech of the capital required to survive the month. The sun sat low over the city, casting long, harsh shadows across the glass walls of the Apex Tower executive boardroom. Julian stood at the head of a massive mahogany table. He looked haggard. His designer suit was wrinkled and dark circles hung heavily beneath his eyes. He paced nervously, gripping a digital tablet. Around the table sat 5 prominent investors, their expressions hardened into masks of deep skepticism. Marcus sat near the back corner, his posture rigid. He was not there to offer moral support. He was there to protect his own financial survival. He had not received his final commission check for securing the penthouse lease, and his creditors were circling. Vanessa sat beside him, clutching a designer handbag tightly against her lap. She glared at Julian, her previous admiration replaced by mounting panic. She had co-signed the lease guarantee, believing she was aligning herself with a billionaire. Now she was watching that billionaire unravel. Julian clapped his hands together, attempting to project authority. "Gentlemen, I assure you last night was an isolated infrastructure anomaly," he announced, his voice slightly hoarse. "We have diagnosed the network throttling issue and are currently pursuing legal action against the building management for breach of utility provision. Our core algorithms remain flawless. We just need to finalize the Series A funding to migrate our data to an independent server farm." The lead investor, a seasoned veteran of Silicon Valley boardroom battles, leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. "We are not writing a check based on excuses, Julian," he countered sharply. "We need to see the raw user data and the audited revenue streams right now. No more projections. Show us the actual cash flow." Before Julian could attempt to spin another lie, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open with a resounding thud. The thick wood hit the rubber wall stoppers, stopping the tense conversation instantly. I stepped over the threshold. I was no longer wearing the faded coat from the Rooftop BBQ or the clearance rack dress from the ruined gala. I wore a bespoke charcoal gray power suit, tailored to project absolute, uncompromising authority. My heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, breaking the heavy silence of the room. Flanking me on either side were two senior partners from the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in the city. They carried thick leather briefcases and moved with the silent, predatory grace of sharks smelling blood in the water. Julian stopped pacing. His eyes darted from the high-powered attorneys to my face. The arrogant smirk he usually reserved for me twisted into a grimace of pure, exasperated disbelief. He pointed a shaking finger toward the doorway. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice rising in pitch. "Are you insane, Harper? Get out of my office. This is a closed-door, multi-million-dollar investor meeting. This is not the place for a broke tenant to file a complaint about a leaky faucet. Security is on its way to escort you off the premises." I did not stop walking. I bypassed the investors and moved directly toward the head of the table. I stopped exactly 3 feet from Julian, holding his frantic gaze with a cold, steady stare. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to command the room. "I am not here to complain about plumbing, Julian," I stated, my tone echoing clearly off the glass walls. "I am here to collect a debt." Marcus jumped up from his chair in the back corner, his face flushing with anger. He stepped forward, trying to assert dominance and protect his failing golden goose. "Have you lost your mind?" Harper, Marcus yelled, waving his hands aggressively. "You cannot just barge into a corporate headquarters. You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing Vanessa. Leave right now before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." I ignored my brother-in-law completely. I gave a subtle nod to the lead attorney standing to my right. The lawyer stepped forward, opening his leather briefcase with a crisp, metallic snap. He withdrew a thick, bound document and placed it squarely in the center of the mahogany table, directly in front of the lead investor. The cover page bore the official seal of the State Commercial Registry. "Allow me to clarify the situation." "Gentlemen," the attorney announced, his voice resonating with deep legal authority, "you are not currently sitting in the corporate headquarters of Oratech. You are sitting in a commercial space legally owned by Apex Holdings, LLC. He tapped the thick document with a silver pen. "I would like to formally introduce you to the sole managing director and primary shareholder of Apex Holdings, Miss Harper." The silence in the boardroom became absolute. The air seemed to freeze, crystallizing the sheer magnitude of the revelation. The venture capitalists stared at the legal document, then slowly shifted their gaze to me. The math instantly clicked in their highly analytical minds. Julian staggered backward, hitting the edge of the mahogany table. His knees visibly buckled. His mouth hung open, entirely incapable of forming a coherent word. He looked down at the lease agreement the attorney had just spread open. The lawyer highlighted the signature page. Julian stared at his own digital signature, a careless flick of the stylus he executed 2 years ago. Right above his signature, printed in stark black ink, was the name of the holding company he never bothered to research. He had signed his life away to the woman he spent years publicly humiliating. The shock paralyzing Julian rapidly mutated into raw, visceral panic. He looked at me, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw a breath. "This is a trick," he stammered, a desperate, pathetic whisper escaping his lips. "You do not own this building. My father would never allow a peasant to buy this property. Your father was heavily overleveraged and facing an aggressive margin call 2 years ago," I replied, delivering the lethal truth without a shred of empathy. "My firm bought the distressed debt portfolio. He lost the building because he was greedy. You lost your company because you were arrogant. You never bothered to look past your own ego long enough to read the contract you signed." I leaned forward, pressing my hands flat against the table, closing the physical distance between us. The trap was fully sprung. "You are currently 48 hours late on your primary rent payment," Julian, I declared, reciting the execution order. "According to the specific default provisions outlined in Section 4 of your lease agreement, all grace periods are waived. I am officially executing a commercial lockout. Effective immediately, every asset inside this penthouse, the servers, the furniture, the computer hardware is legally seized by Apex Holdings to cover your outstanding debt." Julian grabbed his digital tablet, clutching it to his chest like a shield. "You cannot do this!" he shrieked, his voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. "I will sue you. I will tie you up in court for decades. I will ruin you." He was thrashing against the bars of a cage he helped build. He expected a drawn-out legal battle, relying on his father's lawyers to save him. He did not realize that the lease was merely the first layer of the destruction. The true lethal blow, the financial execution that would ensure he never saw the inside of a courtroom as a free man, was resting securely in my briefcase, waiting to be unleashed upon the very investors he was trying to deceive. The word lockout hung in the chilled air of the boardroom, echoing like a death sentence. Julian Sterling remained frozen, his knuckles white, as he gripped his useless digital tablet. He was entirely unequipped to handle a direct frontal assault on his fabricated empire. Marcus, however, was a different breed of predator. He was a street-level hustler wearing an expensive suit, a man who built his entire brokerage career on aggressive intimidation and exploiting legal loopholes. He relied on loud, aggressive bluster to terrify opponents into submission. He saw his massive commission check evaporating, and his survival instincts kicked in with violent urgency. Marcus shoved his chair back, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the floor. He marched toward the head of the table, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his forehead. He pointed a trembling finger at my lead attorney, completely bypassing me in a sexist attempt to undermine my authority. "This is an illegal eviction," Marcus bellowed, his deep voice filling the glass room. "You cannot execute a commercial lockout without a formal 30-day notice and a court-mandated writ of possession. I know commercial real estate law better than anyone in this building. This lease violation is a minor administrative error. If you attempt to seize these assets, I will personally file a civil injunction and bury your shell company in retaliatory damages. Julian has the capital to cure this default immediately." I was projecting false confidence, attempting to bluff the venture capitalists into believing the situation was under control. He needed them to write that Series A funding check to save his own skin. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Julian, forming a desperate, unified front against the truth. I did not argue with his cheap legal posturing. I simply reached into my suit pocket and retrieved a small, encrypted flash drive. I walked past Marcus, ignoring his frantic shouting, and plugged the drive directly into the master console controlling the boardroom presentation matrix. "You claim Julian has the capital to cure the default," Marcus, I asked, my voice cutting through his bluster with surgical precision. "Let us examine the exact nature of that capital." I tapped the execution command on the console keyboard. The massive digital screens wrapping around the boardroom instantly flared to life. They did not display the glossy marketing slides and fake user metrics Julian had prepared for his investors. Instead, the high-definition monitors were flooded with stark black and white financial spreadsheets. I had spent the last 48 hours executing a deep forensic audit, leveraging my firm's access to institutional banking networks to trace every single dollar flowing through the Oratech accounts. The screens displayed a complex web of wire transfers, shell company routing numbers, and hidden escrow accounts. I highlighted a specific transaction block in bright, glaring red. "Gentlemen," I announced, directing my attention to the 5 venture capitalists still seated at the table. You are currently evaluating a massive capital injection into Oratech. I strongly suggest you review the actual origin of the company's initial security deposit. The lead investor squinted, adjusting his glasses to read the glowing numbers on the massive display. The data was undeniable. I turned back to Marcus, locking my eyes onto his terrified, sweating face. 6 months ago, when Oratech required a $500,000 security deposit to secure this penthouse lease, Julian's accounts were completely drained, I stated, projecting the facts clearly across the silent room. You needed the deal to close to secure your broker fee, so you executed a highly illegal maneuver. Marcus took a sudden, involuntary step backward. The aggressive bravado melted from his posture, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. He shook his head, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. The red, highlighted text on the screen pulsed, exposing his ultimate betrayal. You illegally accessed the protected escrow accounts of 3 different commercial clients, I continued relentlessly. You systematically siphoned $500,000 from independent businesses, holding deposits in your brokerage firm. You commingled protected client funds and wired them directly into the Apex Holdings receiving account to cover Julian's deposit. You did not just forge a lease application, Marcus. You committed felony wire fraud. The revelation dropped into the boardroom with the destructive force of a tactical explosive. The 5 venture capitalists leaped from their leather chairs simultaneously. The seasoned investors understood the severe, lethal implications of my statement better than anyone. Wire fraud was not a minor administrative error. It was a severe federal crime carrying decades of prison time. Any company associated with stolen escrow funds would be immediately seized by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The investors realized they were sitting inside an active crime scene, about to write a check to a cartel of fraudsters. "This is a lie," Marcus shrieked, his voice cracking into a desperate, hysterical pitch. He backed away from the screen, his shoulders hitting the heavy glass wall of the boardroom. "She doctored those files. My escrow accounts are secure. I never touched client money. You have to believe me, Julian. She is just trying to destroy us out of spite." The encrypted routing numbers displayed on the massive screens offered zero room for debate. The digital fingerprints were flawless, matching Marcus's unique brokerage license ID to every illicit transfer. He was trapped in a glass cage with his crimes illuminated for the entire world to see. Julian, staring at the screens, finally comprehended the magnitude of the situation. He realized his broker had not magically solved his financial problems. Marcus had tied a federal anchor around his neck and pushed him into the deep end. The arrogant tech visionary persona completely disintegrated. Julian spun around, lunging aggressively toward his brother-in-law. He grabbed Marcus by the lapels of his expensive suit, slamming him back against the glass wall. "You stole the deposit!" Julian roared, spit flying from his lips. "You told me you secured a bridge loan. You told me the money was clean. You brought stolen funds into my company. You ruined me, you incompetent parasite." Marcus shoved Julian away desperately, trying to untangle himself from the physical assault. "I did it to save your pathetic startup." Marcus yelled back, his own panic morphing into vicious defensive rage. "You were begging me for cash. You were burning through millions on private jets and fake marketing campaigns. I put my own neck on the line because you are a fraud, Julian. You do not even know how to write computer code. You are just a spoiled rich kid playing dress-up." The 2 men who had stood on a rooftop 2 years ago, mocking my financial status, were now physically tearing each other apart in front of their biggest investors. The loyalty built on greed collapsed the second the money vanished. The lead venture capitalist did not wait for the fight to conclude. He snapped his briefcase shut with a sharp, definitive click. He pulled out his phone, initiating an emergency call to his risk management team. "Cancel the term sheets," he ordered, barking into the receiver as he marched toward the boardroom exit. "Pull the letters of intent immediately. Oratech is blacklisted. Flag the founders for federal review. We are out. Entirely out." The other 4 investors followed his lead, scrambling out of the boardroom as fast as their legs could carry them. They treated Julian and Marcus like highly contagious diseases, desperately trying to escape the blast radius of the impending federal indictments. Julian stopped grappling with Marcus. He turned his head, watching the venture capitalist disappear down the hallway. The realization hit him with staggering finality. The Series A funding was dead. The company was officially bankrupt. The valuation of Oratech had plummeted from $50 million to absolute zero in less than 3 minutes. He was a ruined man standing in a seized office facing severe criminal charges. The silence rushed back into the room, broken only by the heavy, ragged breathing of the two defeated men. But the destruction was not yet complete. The financial execution had landed perfectly, but the collateral damage was about to claim its final victim. I shifted my gaze toward the back corner of the room, where my sister Vanessa sat frozen, clutching her designer bag, her eyes wide with a terror that went far beyond mere bankruptcy. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind the fleeing venture capitalists, sealing the five of us inside the soundproof glass boardroom. Julian stood paralyzed, staring blankly at the empty chairs where his billionaire future had been sitting just moments ago. Marcus sagged against the glass wall, his tailored suit rumpled, sliding slowly down until he hit the polished hardwood floor. The reality of a federal wire fraud indictment was crushing the oxygen from his lungs. The air in the room was thick with the toxic residue of their shattered egos. A sharp clatter shattered the tense silence. Vanessa dropped her counterfeit designer handbag. The fake leather hit the floor, spilling lipstick and keys across the pristine wood. She had watched the entire scene unfold from the corner, her mind struggling to process the rapid disintegration of her manufactured high society life. She saw the investors flee. She heard the words wire fraud and federal review applied to her husband. The elite social status she craved so desperately, the country club memberships and the luxury vacations were evaporating right in front of her eyes. Her fear instantly mutated into a violent, misdirected rage. She refused to hold her corrupt husband accountable. She refused to blame the arrogant landlord's son who built a fake company. Instead, she locked her furious gaze onto the one person she had always deemed inferior. She blamed me. Vanessa lunged across the boardroom, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged malice. She raised her hand, aiming a vicious slap directly at my face. "You cold-blooded monster!" Vanessa shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "You ruined everything. You destroyed your own brother-in-law out of petty jealousy." I did not flinch or raise my arms to block the strike. I did not need to defend myself. The two corporate attorneys flanking me were not just legal advisors. They brought their own highly trained security detail to the execution. A towering man in a dark suit stepped smoothly out of the shadows near the doorway. He intercepted Vanessa with fluid professional efficiency, catching her raised wrist mid-swing. He twisted her arm gently but firmly behind her back, immobilizing her instantly without causing structural damage. "Let me go, you brute!" Vanessa thrashed wildly, kicking her expensive heels against the security contractor's shins. She glared at me, her eyes burning with pure hatred. "You are a sociopath, Harper. You set us up. Marcus was just trying to provide a good life for our family. You took his career because you are a bitter, miserable spinster living in a slum." I signaled the security contractor with a subtle nod. He released her wrist and stepped back, maintaining a close defensive perimeter. Vanessa stumbled forward, rubbing her arm, breathing heavily. She thought her dramatic outburst would rattle my composure. She thought she could shame me into backing down using the same toxic familial guilt trips she had weaponized since childhood. I adjusted the cuffs of my charcoal blazer. I looked at my sister, stripping away any lingering trace of familial obligation. I evaluated her not as a sibling, but as a highly leveraged liability. "You should redirect that anger towards securing a very aggressive bankruptcy attorney," Vanessa, what I stated, my voice flat and clinical. "Because Marcus losing his brokerage license is the least of your concerns right now." I reached into the leather briefcase resting on the mahogany table. I bypassed the Oratech server logs and withdrew a separate slender manila folder. I withdrew a single sheet of heavy legal paper bearing the official seal of the county clerk. I tossed the document across the polished table. It slid smoothly, stopping just inches from her trembling hands. "Since Oratech is officially bankrupt and the primary tenant is in severe default, I am exercising my legal rights as the primary creditor," I announced, ensuring every word resonated clearly. "I am formally activating the cross-collateralization clause embedded in the lease agreement, the specific clause you willingly authorized as the personal guarantor." Vanessa frowned, staring down at the document. Her lack of financial literacy was her greatest weakness. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her false bravado cracking. "I just signed a character reference. Marcus told me it was just a formality to help Julian secure the space. We do not owe you anything." Marcus let out a pathetic groan from the floor, burying his face in his hands. I knew exactly what was printed on that page. I did not let Marcus explain. I wanted her to hear it from me. Read the asset declaration schedule attached to your signature, Vanessa, I instructed, pointing a manicured finger at the paper. Marcus did not just offer a character reference. He needed a $5 million safety net to push this fraudulent lease through my automated underwriting system. To meet that threshold, your husband forged a property appraisal. He used your residential home as the primary collateral. He then bundled the deed with the college savings funds you set up for your children. Vanessa froze. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her skin a sickly pale gray. Her eyes widened to an unnatural degree as she scanned the legal text. She saw her home address listed under the forfeiture clause. She saw the routing numbers for her children's education funds explicitly pledged against Julian's corporate debt. Marcus pledged everything you own to secure a commission check from a fake billionaire, I concluded, delivering the final devastating truth. And because you signed that document blindly trusting a man who steals from his own clients, you are legally bound to the default. I now hold the primary liens on your entire life. Your house, your cars, your savings. It all belongs to Apex Holdings, effective immediately. The heavy document fluttered from Vanessa's hands, hitting the floor next to her fake Chanel bag. The illusion of her elite life shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She was not a rising socialite. She was a destitute guarantor facing imminent eviction and total financial ruin. The profound betrayal committed by her own husband finally pierced through her blinding greed. Vanessa turned slowly away from the table. She looked down at Marcus, still cowering on the floor. Her entire body shook with a terrifying, silent rage. The woman who just seconds ago tried to assault me for ruining her husband's career now realized that her husband had actively sacrificed their family to save his own skin. "You gave her the house," Vanessa whispered, her voice barely audible. "You gave her my children's money for a commission." Marcus looked up, his face slick with sweat. "Baby, I can fix this," he pleaded, raising his hands defensively. "I had a plan. Julian was going to get the funding. We were going to be rich. It was just a temporary hold. I swear to you I was going to uncouple the assets as soon as the Series A closed." He did not get to finish his pathetic excuse. Vanessa lunged forward, her manicured hands curling into tight fists. She did not slap him. She drove her knee directly into his chest, knocking him backward against the glass. "You stupid, arrogant thief," she screamed, launching a flurry of vicious strikes against his head and shoulders. "You threw us to the wolves for this fake tech, bro. We are homeless, Marcus. We are homeless, Marcus. We have absolutely nothing left." Marcus scrambled backward, trying to shield his face from his wife's frantic assault. He shouted for her to stop, begging Julian to intervene. But Julian remained paralyzed at the head of the table, staring blankly at the empty venture capitalist chairs, completely detached from the domestic violence erupting in his ruined boardroom. The security contractor moved to intervene, but I raised my hand, signaling him to hold his position. I stood with my arms crossed over my chest, watching the brutal, chaotic destruction play out before me. The sophisticated veneer of their lives was entirely stripped away, leaving two desperate, greedy people violently tearing each other apart in the ruins of their own ambition. They had dug their own graves, poured the concrete, and handed me the shovel. The shrieking and the sounds of physical struggle echoed loudly through the penthouse, but the execution was not yet finished. Julian might have lost his investors, and Marcus might be facing federal prison, but the Sterling family patriarch was a man who rarely surrendered without a fight. The sudden, frantic buzzing of Julian's phone signaled the arrival of the final combatant, ready to escalate this bloodbath to an entirely new level of hostility. The brutal physical altercation between Marcus and Vanessa devolved into a pathetic, sobbing mess on the floor. I watched them with absolute detachment. The raw emotional display was messy, inefficient, and entirely foreign to the cold precision of high-level corporate warfare. While they wallowed in their ruined marriage, Julian finally snapped out of his catatonic shock. His billionaire delusion was fiercely resilient. He refused to accept that a woman he once mocked for reporting a broken radiator had methodically dismantled his life. He operated under the deeply ingrained belief that his family name granted him perpetual immunity from consequence. He pulled his smartphone from his tailored jacket, his hands shaking with a potent mix of terror and aggressive entitlement. He bypassed his legal counsel entirely and dialed the local police dispatch. He paced the length of the boardroom, speaking loudly into the receiver, projecting the role of a victimized tech executive. "Yes, I need immediate tactical assistance." Julian barked, his voice echoing over Vanessa's crying. "I am the CEO of Oratech. A disgruntled former tenant has unlawfully breached my corporate headquarters. She brought armed thugs. They are attempting a hostile physical takeover and threatening my executive staff. Send units to the Apex Tower penthouse right now." He severed the connection and slammed the phone onto the mahogany table. He pointed a rigid finger at me, a triumphant sneer returning to his pale face. "You overplayed your hand, Harper," he spat, regaining a fraction of his false bravado. "You think holding a shell company deed gives you the right to orchestrate a physical raid. You just committed felony trespassing and corporate extortion. The police are going to drag you out of here in handcuffs. You will be sitting in a holding cell while my father's lawyers invalidate that ridiculous lease agreement." I did not flinch. I did not order my security detail to block the exits. I simply checked the slim silver watch on my wrist. The timing was aligning perfectly with my operational schedule. "You misunderstand the nature of this visit, Julian," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "We are not conducting a raid. We are facilitating an orderly transition of assets. The authorities are merely here to ensure compliance." 10 agonizing minutes ticked by. The heavy silence in the boardroom was suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of the city traffic far below. The heavy oak doors swung open. 3 uniformed police officers stepped into the room, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They scanned the chaotic scene, noting the weeping couple on the floor and the tense standoff at the head of the table. Julian practically leaped toward the officers, playing the relieved executive to perfection. "Officers, thank God you arrived," he exclaimed, gesturing wildly toward me and my legal team. "This woman and her hired muscle forced their way into my closed board meeting. She is attempting to extort my company and seize my proprietary hardware. I want her arrested for trespassing and attempted corporate theft immediately." The lead officer, a veteran with graying hair and a skeptical gaze, looked at me, assessing the threat. He noted my calm posture and the sharp, expensive tailoring of the lawyers flanking me. This did not look like a violent extortion attempt. It looked like a very expensive legal execution. "Ma'am," the officer stated, his tone firm but professional. "The tenant holds the current lease for this commercial space. I need to ask you and your associates to vacate the premises while we sort out this dispute. If you refuse, we will have to escort you out." I did not argue with the officer. I nodded deferentially and stepped back, allowing my lead corporate attorney to take the floor. The lawyer moved with practiced, smooth efficiency. He did not raise his voice or engage in a shouting match with Julian. He simply unclasped his leather briefcase and retrieved a thick legal document sealed in a transparent protective sleeve. "Officer, there is no dispute to sort out," the attorney stated, handing the document directly to the lead policeman. "This is a court-mandated writ of attachment. It was reviewed and signed by a federal judge at exactly 8 this morning, following a verified breach of contract and an expedited ex parte hearing regarding severe commercial fraud." The officer took the document, clicking on a small tactical flashlight to read the dense legal text. The attorney continued translating the legal jargon into stark reality. Oratech is in terminal default. The tenant has explicitly violated the zero-tolerance financial representation clauses of the lease agreement. The judge has granted Apex Holdings the immediate unilateral right to seize all physical and digital assets within this designated commercial space to satisfy the outstanding debt. My client is not trespassing. She is legally taking possession of her property. Mr. Sterling is the one who no longer holds authorization to be in this room. The officer finished reading the judge's signature. He lowered his flashlight and turned his attention back to Julian. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. The police were no longer there to protect the tech CEO. They were there to enforce the court order. "Sir," the officer addressed Julian, his tone shifting to strict enforcement. "This writ is fully actionable. You and your staff need to step away from all computer terminals and exit the server rooms immediately. You are not permitted to remove any hardware files or proprietary data from this floor." Julian's mouth dropped open. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost haunting his own ruined empire. He looked at the legal document, then at the police officers. His mind fractured, unable to process the absolute reversal of power. He was a sterling. He was supposed to be untouchable. "No!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking into a hysterical, shrill pitch. "This is my company. My servers hold proprietary algorithms. She cannot just steal my life's work." I stepped forward, reclaiming my position at the head of the table. I looked directly into his panicked eyes. "You do not have proprietary algorithms," Julian, I stated, delivering the final crushing blow to his ego. "You have a hollow interface built on stolen escrow funds and fake user metrics. And as of this morning, every single piece of hardware on this floor, the monitors, the server racks, even the mahogany table you are leaning against, is classified as seized collateral. It belongs to me." The realization that he was entirely stripped of his wealth, his status, and his perceived genius completely shattered his fragile psyche. He lost all rational control. Julian lunged forward, launching himself across the boardroom table with a primal, furious roar. He aimed his hands directly at my throat, intent on physically destroying the woman who had systematically dismantled his life. He never reached me. The lead police officer reacted with lightning speed. He intercepted Julian mid-lunge, grabbing the enraged CEO by the collar of his expensive custom tuxedo. The officer utilized Julian's own forward momentum, twisting sharply and slamming the tech visionary face first onto the cold, polished marble floor. Julian grunted in pain as his nose struck the hard stone. The officer drove a heavy knee firmly between Julian's shoulder blades, pinning him securely to the ground. The sharp, unmistakable metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the silent boardroom. "You are under arrest for the attempted assault of an officer and resisting a court mandate," the policeman barked, hauling Julian roughly to his knees. The doors to the outer office had been left wide open during the commotion. Dozens of Auratech employees, drawn by the shouting, had gathered in the hallway. They stood in stunned silence, holding their smartphones high, recording the spectacular downfall of their arrogant boss. The man who had sneered at a broke tenant 2 years ago was now bleeding and handcuffed on the floor of his own seized office, surrounded by the digital evidence of his total failure. I stood perfectly still, watching the police secure their prisoner. The execution was flawless. The trap had closed completely. But the final act of this corporate slaughter was not yet finished. The distinct, sharp chime of the private executive elevator echoing down the hallway signaled the arrival of the final adversary. The heavy steel doors parted, revealing Richard Sterling. The ruthless real estate mogul marched toward the boardroom, completely unaware that he was walking directly into his own financial graveyard. The heavy footsteps of Richard Sterling echoed down the frosted glass corridor, a rhythmic thudding that commanded obedience. He was a man accustomed to bulldozing through obstacles with intimidation and brute financial force. He wore a sharp pinstriped suit that cost more than a reliable car, his silver hair slicked back, projecting the image of an untouchable titan. The employees huddled in the hallway parted instantly, clearing a path for the patriarch. He ignored their stares, marching directly into the boardroom with the furious momentum of a charging bull. Richard stopped dead in his tracks, absorbing the chaotic scene. His eyes locked onto his golden son, bleeding and handcuffed on the marble floor, restrained by a local police officer. He saw the shattered remnants of the elite investor meeting. He saw the high-powered corporate attorneys standing guard. Then his gaze snapped to me, standing confidently at the head of the mahogany table. He recognized me instantly. I was the annoying tenant from Building Unit 4B, the woman who had audacity to report his company to the housing authority over a broken boiler. The disconnect between his memory of the ragged tenant and the tailored executive standing before him caused a violent short circuit in his arrogant mind. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard roared, his deep voice vibrating the glass walls. He did not address the police officers or the attorneys. He directed his unhinged fury entirely at me. "Release my son immediately. I do not care what kind of cheap extortion scheme you are running, Harper. You are severely out of your depth." He reached into his breast pocket and retrieved a sleek leather checkbook and a heavy gold fountain pen. He slapped the book onto the table, scribbling a number with aggressive, violent strokes. He tore the check loose and thrust it toward me. The paper fluttered in his trembling hand. "There is $2 million, Richard snarled, spit flying from his lips. "That covers the default, the alleged damages, and your silence. Take the money, call off your dogs, and get out of my building." A pathetic little renter like you thinks you can play games with the Sterling family. You are nothing. Cash the check and vanish before I crush you." I did not reach for the paper. I let the $2 million bribe hang suspended in the tense air between us. I looked at the man who had built an empire by exploiting the working class, by ignoring safety codes, and squeezing every cent from vulnerable families. He believed wealth was a shield that granted him absolute immunity from consequence. "I am not here to negotiate a settlement, Richard." I stated my voice cold and steady, slicing through his bluster like a surgical blade. "And as my attorney previously clarified, this is no longer your building. I own Apex Tower. I hold the deed." Richard scoffed a harsh barking sound of pure denial. "You are a clerk, Harper. You do not possess the capital to buy a parking garage, let alone a premier commercial high-rise." "You are correct," I replied, maintaining my unyielding posture. "I did not buy the tower with my own capital. I bought it by leveraging the distressed debt your own company generated. You taught me a very valuable lesson about leverage 2 years ago when you raised my rent by 30% to cover your son's vanity projects. You taught me that power belongs to the primary creditor." I turned to my lead attorney, who smoothly handed me a thick, leather-bound portfolio. I placed the heavy stack of documents onto the mahogany table, pushing it directly next to Richard's pathetic $2 million check. The cover page bore the unmistakable bold red insignia of the Federal Reserve and the primary institutional lending bank that held the Sterling family's largest mortgages. Richard's arrogant sneer faltered. His eyes tracked the logo, and a sudden sharp knot of dread formed in his chest. "Keep your pocket change, Richard," I advised, tapping the thick portfolio. "You are going to need every single cent to cover the liquidation." For the past 6 months, I have not just been managing the Apex lease, I continued the systematic dismantling of his reality. I utilized my position at the private equity firm to execute a quiet, relentless sweep of the secondary market. Your family empire is a house of cards built on toxic leverage. You siphoned equity from your residential properties to fund your luxury lifestyle, leaving your core assets dangerously exposed. I systematically acquired every single non-performing loan, every defaulted promissory note, and every piece of distressed debt tied to the Sterling Real Estate Group. Richard staggered backward, hitting the back of a leather chair. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking old and incredibly fragile. He understood the lethal mechanics of the secondary market. He knew that whoever held the consolidated debt held the keys to his entire kingdom. "I am the primary lien holder on your entire residential portfolio," I declared, ensuring the finality of the execution echoed in the silent room. "You breached the debt service coverage ratios on 3 separate commercial loans yesterday afternoon when Oratech's valuation collapsed. Those breaches triggered a catastrophic cross-default across your entire network." I leaned forward, pressing my hands against the table. "I officially activated the priority margin call this morning at exactly 8:00. "No!" Richard gasped, clutching the edge of the chair, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "You cannot execute a margin call of that magnitude. It violates the forbearance agreements." I bought out the forbearance agreements, I countered, shutting down his last desperate hope. "The math is absolute, Richard. You have exactly 24 hours to produce $40 million in verified liquid capital. If you fail to deposit those funds, the bank will immediately seize your entire property portfolio, including your primary residence, your offshore accounts, and this miserable tech company. You are bankrupt." The patriarch of the Sterling family, the ruthless mogul who had terrified tenants and bullied contractors for decades, finally broke. The sheer impossible weight of $40 million in immediate debt crushed his spine. He clutched his chest, his breathing turning into shallow, ragged gasps. He sank slowly to his knees, collapsing onto the cold marble floor, right next to his handcuffed son. Julian stared at his father in absolute horror. The invincible Titan had fallen entirely decimated by the woman they both considered a worthless peasant. The Sterling legacy was erased, reduced to a mountain of toxic debt and a pile of federal indictments. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by Richard's wheezing breaths. But the financial slaughter was not yet complete. The corporate structure was dead, and the patriarch was broken, but the criminal justice system was about to claim its pound of flesh. A sharp, piercing alarm suddenly echoed through the penthouse corridors, signaling the arrival of the federal authorities, ready to tear the final rotting shreds of this family apart. The rhythmic gasping of Richard Sterling, kneeling defeated on the floor, provided a pathetic soundtrack to the destruction. He clutched his chest, his bespoke suit wrinkling as he stared blankly at the polished marble. The illusion of his generational wealth had evaporated, leaving only the suffocating reality of a $40 million margin call. Julian remained pinned beneath the local officer, his nose bleeding sluggishly onto the stone. The boardroom was a tableau of total ruin. The execution was meticulous, and the financial decimation was absolute. A sudden, piercing shriek shattered the heavy atmosphere. The building's emergency alarm system engaged. The harsh electronic wail echoed through the high ceilings, accompanied by blinding strobe lights flashing in the corridors. The Oratech employees gathered outside the glass walls, panicked, scattering like startled insects. This was not a standard fire drill. The alarm was a pre-programmed operational signal initiated by the building management protocol I controlled. It was the designated clearance tone. The final sweep was commencing. Heavy tactical boots thudded against the hardwood hallway, cutting through the shrill alarm. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom were shoved open with organized, disciplined force. A specialized unit of federal agents swarmed into the room. They wore dark windbreakers emblazoned with the stark yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They did not move with the frantic energy of local beat cops. They moved with the cold, precise efficiency of a federal task force executing a meticulously planned takedown. The lead agent, a tall woman with sharp, calculating eyes, bypassed Julian entirely. She ignored the bleeding tech CEO and the hyperventilating patriarch on the floor. Her target was a different kind of parasite. She locked her gaze onto the back corner of the room, where Marcus was desperately trying to blend into the shadows. He had quietly distanced himself from the physical altercation, hoping the chaos would provide a distraction long enough for him to slip out the service exit. He underestimated the breadth of my snare. The agent marched directly toward him, flashing a silver badge. "Marcus, you are hereby detained," the agent announced, her voice slicing cleanly through the wailing alarm. "You are under investigation for multiple counts of felony wire fraud, systemic securities manipulation, and international money laundering." Marcus froze. The slick, polished broker who built his entire persona on aggressive negotiation and fast-talking charm was rendered completely mute. He looked at the federal badge, and the terrifying reality of his actions finally registered. He had forged property appraisals, manipulated escrow accounts, and lied on federal loan applications to secure a single commission check. The fake accounting data I submitted anonymously to the Securities and Exchange Commission 48 hours ago had triggered a massive priority investigation. The digital trail was airtight. "Please," Marcus whimpered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched plea. "There is a terrible mistake. I am just a broker. I was following client directives. You need to look at Julian. He is the CEO." "We have the escrow routing numbers," Marcus, the agent, countered, shutting down his pathetic deflection instantly. "We have the digital signatures confirming you personally authorized the transfer of stolen client funds to artificial shell corporations. Put your hands behind your back immediately." The physical toll of the impending arrest broke him. Marcus lost total control of his bodily functions. A dark, humiliating stain spread rapidly down the front of his tailored trousers, pooling on the expensive hardwood floor. He dropped to his knees, weeping openly. He turned his desperate, tear-streaked face toward his wife. "Vanessa, help me," Marcus sobbed, reaching a trembling hand toward her. "Tell them I was just trying to provide for us. Tell them about the house. Call my lawyer. Please, baby, do not let them take me." Vanessa stood frozen, clutching her fake designer bag against her chest. She looked at her husband, kneeling in his own filth, begging for salvation. She looked at the federal agents closing in with heavy steel restraints. The greed that had blinded her for years finally evaporated, replaced by pure, instinctual self-preservation. The social climbing sister, who had hurled a glass of red wine at me for warning her about this exact scenario, made her final calculation. She stepped backward, creating a deliberate physical and emotional distance. "I do not know what he is talking about." Vanessa stated, her voice trembling, but remarkably cold. "I only signed a character reference. I have zero involvement in his brokerage firm. I want a divorce." She threw her husband to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. Marcus wailed a horrific guttural sound of total abandonment as the agent secured his wrists. The cold metallic ratcheting of the handcuffs echoed loudly, signifying the permanent end of his fraudulent career. The local police hauled Julian up from the floor. He offered no resistance, his spirit completely broken by the physical restraint and the total loss of his company. The two men who had stood on the rooftop laughing at my worn coat and mocking my bank account were now being marched out of the boardroom in disgrace. They were led out through separate elevator banks destined for different holding cells. They had lost their freedom, their wealth, and their dignity in a matter of minutes. The boardroom emptied rapidly. The agents escorted the prisoners away, leaving only my legal team, the sobbing remnants of Vanessa and the broken patriarch Richard Sterling, still gasping on the floor. I walked calmly to the head of the mahogany table. I picked up a cold cup of coffee abandoned by one of the fleeing investors. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the bitter taste. I retrieved a final legal document from my briefcase. It was the formal commercial lockdown order. I signed my name with a smooth, fluid stroke, authorizing the immediate sealing of the entire 40th floor. The execution was flawless. The empire was ashes. But the consequences of this financial slaughter were about to ripple out far beyond the glass walls of Apex Tower, crashing directly into the crumbling foundation of the Sterling family's personal life. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers faded into the distance, taking the architects of the fraud away in heavy steel cuffs. The boardroom sat empty, a glass tomb for a fake empire. The financial execution was complete, but the practical fallout of Richard Sterling's colossal default required immediate on-the-ground enforcement. The margin call I initiated that morning triggered a cascading chain of asset forfeitures. The $40 million debt had to be satisfied, and the banks moved with ruthless efficiency. By sunset, the management rights to the entire Sterling residential portfolio transferred directly to the primary creditor. The decaying apartment building where Julian had mocked me 2 years ago was now officially under my corporate control. I drove back to the familiar cracked concrete parking lot. The neighborhood was quiet, unaware of the seismic shift in ownership. I did not park in my usual spot near the overflowing dumpsters. I parked the sleek company SUV directly in front of the main entrance, occupying the space Richard used to reserve exclusively for his luxury sedans. I stepped out of the vehicle, the cool evening air, a stark contrast to the sterile, chilled atmosphere of the boardroom. I wore the same charcoal suit, the fabric acting as a physical armor against the emotional wreckage I was about to confront. I walked up the dimly lit stairwell, the scent of stale cooking oil and damp plaster filling the hallway. My destination was not my old unit. It was the renovated double apartment at the end of the hall. Vanessa had retreated there after the FBI raid, seeking temporary shelter in a unit Richard kept vacant for family use. Her own heavily leveraged suburban mansion was already seized by the bank. The cross-collateralization clause Marcus signed had triggered an immediate lockout when the federal agent stormed his office. Vanessa was a socialite without a society, a woman clutching fake designer bags with nowhere left to run. Before I could reach the door, it burst open. Vanessa stumbled into the hallway, dragging a massive hard-shell suitcase behind her. Her makeup was smeared, tracing dark streaks down her face. She looked frantic, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She was throwing expensive clothes into the bag without folding them, driven by raw panic. She saw me standing in the corridor and froze. The arrogant sister who constantly belittled my lifestyle, who hurled a glass of wine at my chest for offering legal advice, collapsed entirely. She did not yell or demand answers. She dropped the handle of her suitcase and sank to her knees on the stained hallway carpet. She pressed her hands together, her shoulders shaking with loud, ragged sobs. "Harper, please," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "You have to help me. I have absolutely nowhere to go." The bank locked the doors to the house. The security codes are changed. Marcus is sitting in a federal holding cell, and the lawyer requires a $50,000 retainer just to look at his case. My credit cards are declining everywhere. I cannot even buy a hotel room for the night. You are my sister. You cannot leave me on the street. I looked down at her, kneeling on the cheap carpet. I felt zero pity. I evaluated her current state with the same clinical detachment I used to analyze a failing corporate spreadsheet. She was invoking biological ties only because her financial lifelines were severed. When she believed Marcus was securing a fortune, she proudly cast me aside. Family was merely a convenience for Vanessa, a safety net she only acknowledged when she was falling. I did not step forward to comfort her. I remained perfectly still, maintaining a strict professional distance. "You are currently occupying a unit within a commercial property managed by Apex Holdings," I stated, keeping my voice flat and devoid of any familial warmth. "You do not possess a valid lease agreement for this space. Richard Sterling is no longer the landlord. The grace period for unauthorized occupants expired an hour ago." Vanessa stared up at me, her tear-streaked face twisting in confusion. "What are you saying?" she whispered, the reality struggling to penetrate her panic. "This is Dad's building. I just need to stay here for a few days until I can sort out the accounts. Richard Sterling is bankrupt." "Vanessa," I clarified, ensuring the truth landed with full impact. "His entire portfolio was seized to cover a massive margin call. He owns nothing. I control this property now. And as the legal owner, I am formally executing an immediate eviction. You have exactly 2 hours to remove your personal belongings from this unit. If you remain on the premises after the deadline, I will instruct the property management team to have you escorted out for trespassing." "You cannot do this!" Vanessa shrieked, the despair morphing instantly back into entitlement. "I am your flesh and blood. You are punishing me for Marcus's mistakes. I did not know he was stealing money. I am a victim here." "You knew he forged the appraisal on the house," I countered, shutting down her false narrative. "You happily signed the guarantor paperwork because you wanted the yacht club membership and the Hamptons vacations. You actively participated in the fraud, Vanessa. Ignorance is a choice you made to fund your greed. You have 1 hour and 58 minutes left." I turned my back on her, leaving her kneeling in the hallway. I walked toward my old apartment. I heard her scream my name, a high-pitched wail of absolute desperation, echoing off the peeling walls. She pounded her fists against the carpet, throwing a violent tantrum. I did not pause or look back. I opened my door, stepped inside, and let the heavy wood slam shut, severing the connection permanently. I walked to my desk and opened my laptop. The glowing screen provided a familiar, comforting logic. The physical eviction was underway, but the digital warfare was far from over. My secure corporate phone buzzed on the desk. An incoming message notification flashed across the screen. The sender was an unknown number, but the arrogant tone was unmistakable. It was Julian. His wealthy father, despite being crushed by debt, managed to scrape together enough loose capital from hidden offshore accounts to post Julian's bail. The tech CEO was out of the holding cell, but his ego remained dangerously intact. He refused to accept his defeat. "You think you won, you pathetic renter," the text message read. "My father's legal team is filing a massive civil suit tomorrow morning. We are going to tie your shell company up in Supreme Court litigation for the next decade. We will bleed you dry in legal fees. You stole my company. Prepare to lose everything." I read the message twice, a slow, chilling smile forming on my lips. Julian believed the battle would be fought in quiet courtrooms, relying on slow-moving judicial bureaucracy. He thought he could hide behind expensive lawyers and manipulate the narrative. He failed to understand that I had no intention of playing a defensive legal game. I was going to burn his reputation to the ground in the court of public opinion. I opened a secure encrypted email client. I attached the comprehensive forensic audit file, the exact same document I presented in the boardroom, exposing the wire fraud, the fake user metrics, and the stolen escrow funds. I added the forged lease agreement and the police arrest reports. I compiled the ultimate dossier of corporate corruption. I did not send the file to a judge or a regulatory agency. I populated the recipient list with the direct contact addresses for the top investigative journalists at the Wall Street Journal, TechCrunch, and the primary financial news networks. I typed a brief anonymous message summarizing the contents. I clicked send. The data packets launched into the digital ether, disseminating the unvarnished truth to the most aggressive media outlets in the country. Julian wanted a war. I just handed the media the ammunition to launch a nuclear strike. Tomorrow morning, the world would wake up to the truth, and the resulting media storm would completely obliterate whatever fragments of his life remained. The digital execution I initiated at midnight detonated exactly at dawn. The high-speed fiber optic lines of the financial district carried the leaked dossier directly to the editorial desks of the most aggressive journalists in the country. By the time I poured my first cup of coffee, the financial news cycle was entirely consumed by the carnage. I turned on my primary monitor and watched the destruction unfold in real time. The Wall Street Journal homepage featured a stark high-definition photograph of Julian Sterling. It was not a polished headshot from a tech magazine. It was a candid cell phone image captured by an employee during the Boardroom raid, showing Julian face down on the marble floor with his hands secured behind his back in heavy steel cuffs. The bold headline above the image read, "Oratech Collapse. Silicon Valley Prodigy Arrested Amidst Massive Wire Fraud Allegations." TechCrunch ran a parallel feature dissecting the forensic audit I provided, exposing the fake user metrics and the hollow software architecture. The public exposure triggered an immediate catastrophic chain reaction. The venture capitalists who had fled the Boardroom the previous day officially filed a class action lawsuit against Julian and the Oratech Executive Board before 9 o'clock. They were seeking millions in punitive damages for gross misrepresentation and intentional fraud. The legal filings were public record cementing Julian's status as toxic radioactive waste in the corporate sector. Julian, barricaded in a cheap motel room after his release on bail, spent the morning frantically dialing his extensive network of elite contacts. He called the angel investors who previously praised his vision. He dialed the tech bloggers who once wrote glowing reviews of his lifestyle. He reached out to the wealthy socialites who attended his lavish parties. Every single call went directly to voicemail. His numbers were blocked across the board. The elite circle he worshipped was a ruthless ecosystem. They only tolerated arrogance when it was backed by capital. The second his wealth evaporated and the federal indictments dropped, he was instantly excised from their ranks like a malignant tumor. The final blow to Julian's defense strategy arrived just before noon. He desperately contacted his retained corporate defense attorney, demanding the firm file an emergency injunction to halt the asset seizure. The senior partner answered the call, but the conversation was brief and brutally transactional. The law firm had already reviewed the public financial disclosures and realized Oratech was entirely bankrupt. Without a guaranteed retainer, the firm formally severed all ties, leaving Julian entirely unrepresented against a mountain of federal charges. The humiliation reached its absolute peak later that afternoon. Julian was required to appear at the downtown municipal courthouse for a mandatory preliminary hearing regarding his assault charge on the police officer. In the past, he would have arrived in a chauffeured black luxury SUV flanked by a team of aggressive lawyers. That reality was dead. His entire fleet of leased sports cars was seized by the primary creditors the moment the company defaulted. A freelance photographer stationed outside the courthouse captured a profoundly pathetic image. Julian Sterling, the former self-proclaimed billionaire tech visionary, was photographed stepping off a crowded public city bus. He wore the same wrinkled custom tuxedo from the ruined gala. He looked disheveled, exhausted, and utterly defeated as he navigated the crowded sidewalk, forced to mingle with the working-class citizens his family had spent decades exploiting. The photograph went viral, instantly becoming a global meme symbolizing the ultimate collapse of arrogant tech culture. The fallout from the margin call hit Richard Sterling with equal severity. The patriarch who built his life on intimidation and predatory lending found himself entirely isolated when his portfolio imploded. The stress of the total liquidation coupled with the public disgrace of his son's arrest triggered a severe cardiac event. Richard collapsed in the lobby of a secondary bank while desperately attempting to secure a predatory payday loan. He was rushed to a local hospital. There were no private VIP recovery suites available to him. His premium health insurance was tied to the corporate accounts currently frozen by federal auditors. He lay in a standard crowded municipal ward, surrounded by the very people his business practices had marginalized. No high-powered associates visited him. Julian was consumed by his own legal nightmare, and his ex-wife had filed for divorce years ago. The titan of real estate was reduced to a frail old man staring at a ceiling tile while his life's work was carved up and sold at auction by anonymous institutional creditors. The capitalist machine he weaponized his entire life was now actively grinding him into dust without a shred of empathy. I monitored the news feeds, savoring the clinical precision of their downfall. The board was nearly clear. The primary threats were neutralized. But parasitic behavior rarely dies quietly. It mutates, seeking new avenues for survival. My secure corporate phone buzzed on the desk. My lead attorney sent an urgent text message flagging a new complication. I opened the link attached to the message. It redirected to a prominent local gossip blog known for paying cash for scandalous tips. The headline read, "Exclusive Tell-All: The Ruthless Billionaire Sister Who Destroyed Her Own Family. Interview airs tonight." Vanessa, having been unceremoniously evicted from the apartment building the previous night, was refusing to fade into obscurity. Stripped of her husband, her house, and her credit cards, she resorted to the only currency she had left: her perceived victimhood. She had contacted a sleazy tabloid television producer, offering to sell a fabricated sob story, portraying me as a cold, calculating monster who orchestrated a hostile takeover purely out of spite. She planned to sit in front of a camera, squeeze out fake tears, and collect a meager paycheck by dragging my name through the mud. She thought public shaming would force me into offering her a financial settlement to protect my corporate reputation. She failed to understand that I did not operate on emotion or fear of public opinion. I operated strictly on binding legal contracts. Vanessa was about to discover that signing her name as a guarantor carried consequences far beyond losing her suburban mansion. The trap she willingly stepped into contained a secondary trigger, and I was ready to pull it. The harsh artificial lights of the local television studio illuminated Vanessa, sitting stiffly in a cheap faux leather guest chair. The makeup artists had deliberately applied her foundation to make her look pale and distressed, crafting the perfect visual for a victim narrative. She clutched a tissue, nervously rehearsing the fabricated lines she planned to feed the tabloid host. She was prepared to paint me as a vindictive monster, hoping the resulting scandal would extort a settlement from my firm. She was banking on the belief that wealthy executives feared bad press more than they feared losing capital. The studio director counted down from 10, preparing to go live. The cameras swung toward Vanessa, the red recording light blinking ominously. Before the host could utter a single word of introduction, the heavy soundproof doors of the studio burst open. The disruption was not a chaotic scene. It was a highly organized surgical strike. My lead corporate attorney strode onto the set, flanked by 2 building security guards. He did not yell or act aggressively. He simply held up a thick legal document sealed with the official stamp of the state Supreme Court. "Shut the cameras down," the attorney commanded, his voice projecting clear, unquestionable authority. "This broadcast is in direct violation of a sealed federal mandate. If you transmit a single second of this interview, this network will be named as a co-defendant in a multi-million-dollar civil liability suit." The studio director panicked, instantly signaling the crew to cut the feed. The red recording lights went dark. The host lowered his microphone, looking confused and incredibly irritated. Vanessa leaped from her chair, her carefully constructed victim persona shattering instantly. "You cannot do this," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the attorney. "Freedom of speech. You cannot stop me from telling my story. My sister ruined my life. I have a right to expose her." The attorney ignored her dramatic outburst. He walked calmly across the studio floor, bypassing the host and stopping directly in front of Vanessa. He handed her the thick legal document. "You waived your right to publicly disparage my client the moment you signed your name to the Oratech commercial lease guarantee," the attorney stated, delivering the facts with lethal precision. Section 8, Paragraph 4 explicitly outlines a strict non-disparagement clause tied directly to the cross-collateralization agreement. Vanessa stared blindly at the dense legal text, unable to comprehend the trap closing around her. "What does that mean?" she stammered, her voice dropping to a frightened whisper. "It means," Vanessa the attorney clarified, ensuring the studio crew heard every word, "that if you utter a single negative public statement regarding Apex Holdings or its managing director, you automatically trigger an immediate liquidated damages penalty. That penalty is valued at exactly $5 million. Since you are already in default, any further violation will result in the immediate garnishment of any future wages you ever earn. You will spend the rest of your natural life working strictly to pay off a defamation debt." The heavy document slipped from her hands, hitting the studio floor. The reality of her situation crashed down upon her, suffocating her final desperate scheme. She was not just broke, she was legally gagged. The contract she signed out of blind greed had stripped her of her home, her savings, and now her very voice. She was completely neutralized, a ghost, forced to wander the ruins of her own ambition without the ability to even cry out for help. The studio host, realizing the legal liability sitting in his chair, immediately signaled for security. "Escort her out," he barked, pointing toward the exit. "We are not getting sued over a fake sob story." Vanessa was unceremoniously grabbed by the arms and marched off the set. The makeup artists and camera crew watched her go, their initial sympathy replaced by cold, professional detachment. She was shoved out the back exit of the television station, stumbling onto the dirty pavement of the alleyway. She stood alone, shivering in her wrinkled clothes, utterly silenced and entirely invisible. I watched the entire sequence unfold via a secure live feed transmitted from my attorney's phone. I stood on the expansive glass balcony of the Apex Tower penthouse, the very space Julian had arrogantly claimed as his own just a few days prior. The cold wind whipped across the high-rise, carrying the distant hum of the city traffic far below. I looked down at the sprawling grid of streets, the glowing headlights forming rivers of light cutting through the darkness. The board was completely clear. The execution was total and uncompromising. Marcus was sitting in a federal cell awaiting trial for wire fraud. Julian was a public laughingstock stripped of his wealth, facing severe assault charges. Richard was broken and hospitalized, his real estate empire carved up by merciless creditors. And Vanessa, the sister who had hurled wine at me and mocked my existence, was effectively erased from society, wandering the streets without a voice or a safety net. They had all believed that power was derived from loud arrogance, designer labels, and aggressive intimidation. I proved that true power is silent. True power is buried in the fine print of legal contracts executed with patience and unleashed only when the trap is perfectly sealed. I turned away from the balcony, walking back into the massive, empty penthouse. The space was stripped of Julian's cheap rented furniture, leaving only bare concrete floors and exposed steel beams. It was a blank canvas ready to be repurposed. The parasitic elements were eradicated, but the structure they left behind required a complete transformation. I picked up my phone and dialed the head of my architectural development team. The demolition phase was over. It was time to build a new paradigm upon the ashes of the Sterling legacy. A paradigm that would not just erase their memory, but actively rewrite the rules of the ecosystem they had corrupted. The final phase of the operation was about to commence, ensuring the name Sterling was never spoken in this building again. 6 months erased the fraudulent stain Julian Sterling left on the 70th floor. The Apex Tower penthouse underwent a surgical renovation. I ordered the demolition crews to strip away the velvet lounges, the imported marble wet bars, and the frosted glass vanity walls Julian utilized to distract naive investors from his lack of an actual product. The new architecture favored relentless utility. Floor-to-ceiling windows now illuminated rows of ergonomic workstations, interactive rendering screens, and high-density server racks. The space transformed from a playground for arrogant tech heirs into a fortified incubator. I dedicated the entire floor to funding and scaling startups founded exclusively by women and minority entrepreneurs. These creators did not rely on golf course handshakes or nepotism. They secured their desks by presenting viable code, sustainable business models, and verified revenue projections. The capital injected into these new ventures carried a poetic weight. I did not solicit funds from standard venture capital firms. Every dollar funding the incubator flowed directly from the liquidated remnants of the Sterling real estate portfolio and the seized assets of Marcus brokerage accounts. The wealth Richard Sterling spent decades extracting from neglected tenants through exorbitant rent hikes now financed a housing logistics algorithm developed by a young woman from a marginalized district. The escrow deposits Marcus stole to purchase his sports cars now funded a cybersecurity platform built by an immigrant software engineer. I weaponized their greed, converting their toxic assets into a foundation for the very demographics they historically overlooked and exploited. The contracts I offered these founders lacked the predatory clauses Marcus favored. They established transparent equity sharing, proving that building an empire did not require deceit. The architects of the previous regime were currently adapting to their new harsh environments. Marcus failed to secure a lenient plea agreement. The federal prosecutors wielding the comprehensive digital ledger I handed them dismantled his defense in days. I attended the sentencing hearing sitting quietly in the back row of the sterile courtroom. Marcus wore a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, his wrists bound by chains. He wept openly when the federal judge read the verdict. The judge cited his flagrant abuse of fiduciary duty and the devastating impact of wire fraud on vulnerable clients. The gavel struck the block, condemning him to 15 years in a medium-security penitentiary. The slick broker who thrived on expensive dinners and aggressive intimidation was reduced to a federal inmate number. His days were now dictated by strict headcounts, metal bunks, and the uncompromising authority of prison guards. He traded his luxury sedan for a concrete cell. Vanessa existed in a different variation of confinement. Stripped of her suburban mansion and legally paralyzed by the $5 million defamation penalty, she vanished from the socialite circles she so desperately worshipped. Her wealthy friends stopped returning her calls the moment her credit cards declined. Without a degree or tangible skills, she plummeted down the socioeconomic ladder. My legal team maintained routine surveillance to ensure her strict compliance with the gag order. She found employment as a nighttime sanitation worker at a discount grocery store located far beyond the city limits. The sister who once hurled a glass of wine at my chest for wearing cheap clothes now spent her evenings pushing a heavy yellow mop bucket down aisles stained with spilled soda and tracked mud. She wore thick rubber gloves, her hands calloused from harsh chemical cleaners. She scrubbed linoleum floors in perpetual silence, terrified that uttering a single complaint about her situation would trigger the financial trap hovering over her minimum wage checks. She was trapped in a purgatory of her own, making a ghost, haunting the clearance aisles. The morning sunlight flooded the new incubator as I stood before the assembled founders to finalize the launch. There were no theatrical speeches or hollow promises of changing the world. I held a pair of simple steel shears and cut the ceremonial ribbon suspended across the main corridor. The room filled with genuine applause, a grounded sound earned through diligent work and verified metrics. I spent an hour reviewing a promising financial technology prototype with a team of developers before excusing myself. The penthouse was thriving, running on pure operational logic. I had a secondary inspection to conduct down on the ground floor. I bypassed the crowded passenger elevator, stepping into my private express car. The descent was smooth, swift, and silent, carrying me down 70 floors to the foundation of my building. The main lobby of Apex Tower bustled with the relentless energy of the midday corporate rush. Executives, couriers, and analysts crossed the polished marble floors, navigating the strict biometric security turnstiles. I walked past the reception desk, heading toward the rear service corridors to evaluate a recent logistical upgrade to the freight loading docks. The service entrance lacked the polished glamour of the main atrium. It was a functional, gritty space filled with the harsh grinding of pallet jacks, the scent of diesel exhaust from idling delivery trucks, and the sharp shouts of logistics coordinators managing the inbound freight. A commercial box truck sat parked unevenly near the primary loading ramp. A newly hired delivery worker struggled to maneuver a rusted hand truck over the jagged concrete threshold. The cart was heavily loaded with stackable 5-gallon water jugs destined for the lower-level office coolers. The worker wore a cheap synthetic blue uniform shirt, the fabric stained dark with sweat across his shoulder blades. His posture was hunched, his muscles visibly shaking under the physical burden of the mundane, grueling labor. He grunted in exertion, his breath ragged and shallow, as the heavy rubber wheels caught on a raised metal drainage grate. The towering stack of water jugs shifted precariously, threatening to topple onto the dirty concrete. He strained to correct the balance, his boots scraping for traction against the floor. He paused, letting the hand truck rest against his knee to wipe a thick layer of grime from his forehead, using the back of a bruised hand. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the loading dock flickered, illuminating his profile. His face was gaunt, the arrogant cheekbones hollowed out by months of severe stress, mounting legal debts, and the sudden shocking evaporation of his trust fund. The expensive haircuts, bespoke linen blazers, and Italian loafers were replaced by a frayed baseball cap and heavy work boots scuffed with warehouse dirt. He looked up, gasping for air, his eyes scanning the service corridor. It was Julian Sterling. The heavy industrial fan humming above the loading dock provided a droning soundtrack to the stark reality unfolding on the concrete floor. Julian Sterling stood frozen, his hands gripping the rusted metal handles of the delivery cart. The harsh fluorescent lighting stripped away any lingering illusions of his former elite status, exposing the severe physical toll of his financial ruin. His cheekbones protruded sharply beneath pale skin. The confident swagger that once defined his every movement was replaced by the hunched defensive posture of a man accustomed to constant defeat. He stared at me, attempting to process the impossible visual before him. I wore a tailored cashmere overcoat, the deep charcoal fabric falling elegantly past my knees, offering a stark contrast to his sweat-stained synthetic uniform. 2 years ago, he looked down at my worn winter jacket from a rooftop parapet and declared me a permanent fixture of the underclass. He laughed while his brother-in-law Marcus planned to steal my mother's retirement funds. He cheered while his sister Vanessa poured wine on my clothes. Now the hierarchy was irreversibly inverted. He was wearing the uniform of a manual laborer, toiling in the bowels of the very skyscraper he once claimed to rule. The sudden shock severed his grip on the hand truck. The heavy cart tilted backward. A 5-gallon plastic water jug slipped from the top tier, plummeting toward the ground. It struck the unforgiving concrete floor with a sharp, deafening crack. The thick plastic casing ruptured upon impact, sending a wave of purified water rushing across the loading dock. The liquid pooled rapidly, soaking into the frayed edges of Julian's cheap work boots. He flinched at the noise, his shoulders jumping nervously. For a fleeting second, the instinct to flee overwhelmed him. I watched his eyes dart toward the service exit, searching for an escape route. He wanted to turn his back, run into the humid city streets, and hide from the profound humiliation of this encounter. He shifted his weight, preparing to abandon the cart and the spilled water. But he did not run. He could not run. The crushing weight of his new socioeconomic reality anchored his boots to the wet floor. Julian was a convicted felon, burdened by astronomical court-ordered restitution fees and insurmountable civil judgments. The venture capitalists he defrauded had systematically drained his remaining hidden accounts through ruthless litigation. His father, Richard, was rotting in a low-income care facility, unable to provide a single cent of salvation. His sister, Vanessa, was scrubbing grocery store floors miles away, legally gagged and drowning in debt. Marcus was staring at the cinder-block walls of a federal penitentiary. The entire Sterling dynasty was eradicated. Julian needed this grueling minimum-wage job just to afford a bed in a decaying boarding house on the outskirts of the city. Walking away from this spilled water meant immediate termination, and termination meant sleeping on the cold pavement. The arrogant tech founder was trapped by the very necessity of basic daily survival. I did not issue orders to the security guards stationed near the freight elevators. I did not need to leverage physical force or shout demands. I walked slowly toward him, my heels clicking with a measured, deliberate rhythm against the damp concrete. I stepped carefully around the expanding puddle of water, stopping exactly 2 feet in front of his trembling frame. I looked at the spilled jug, then raised my gaze to meet his eyes. I did not project anger or harbor any lingering resentment. Hatred requires emotional investment, and Julian no longer warranted any space in my mind. I looked at him with the mild, detached indifference a property owner reserves for a scuffed floorboard or a broken light bulb. A faint, calm smile touched the corners of my mouth. The tile floor in Sector D is still dirty. Julian, I stated, my voice smooth and perfectly modulated, echoing softly over the hum of the ventilation fans. I let the instruction hang in the chill air, watching the muscles in his jaw clench tight. He knew Sector D. It was the corridor leading to the employee restrooms, a high-traffic area requiring constant sanitation. I was giving him a direct menial order. I tilted my head slightly, delivering the final verbal strike with surgical precision. I recycled the exact insult he had weaponized against me on that humid rooftop 2 years prior. I repurposed his own cruel arrogance and fed it back to him. Some people just cannot afford better, I said, maintaining a flawless, steady gaze. They are destined to clean up messes because they simply lack the capacity to do anything else. The words landed with devastating accuracy. Julian squeezed his eyes shut, a vivid flush of deep, humiliating crimson creeping up his neck. His hands trembled at his sides. The urge to lash out, to scream or raise his fists warred visibly against his instinct for self-preservation. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He opened his eyes, looking down at the ruined water jug and his soaked boots. He made his choice. The billionaire delusion died permanently right there on the wet concrete. Julian bowed his head, breaking eye contact. He reached down with shaky fingers, righting the fallen hand truck and gripping the rusted handles. He nodded silently, accepting his subjugation. He turned away, dragging the heavy cart toward the service janitorial closet to retrieve a mop. He did not utter a single word of protest. I turned my back on him. I did not monitor his retreat. I walked toward the private loading bay where my driver waited beside a sleek black SUV. The driver stepped forward, opening the heavy armored door. I slid into the pristine leather interior, the quiet cabin instantly muting the harsh noise of the loading dock. The door shut with a solid, definitive click, sealing me inside my sanctuary. The vehicle glided smoothly up the exit ramp, merging seamlessly into the bustling city traffic. I leaned back into the plush seat, looking out the tinted window. The towering glass reflection of Apex Tower faded into the sprawling skyline, a silent monument to a flawless acquisition. The long, methodical campaign was officially concluded. I spent my entire professional career evaluating the vulnerabilities of failing corporations. I assessed risk-examined liabilities and mapped out the precise pressure points required to execute a hostile takeover. For years, the Sterling family believed they were the predators in the ecosystem. They assumed their inherited wealth and aggressive posturing rendered them immune to the rules governing the rest of society. They viewed people like my mother as disposable collateral and treated my sister's foolish vanity as a tool for their own enrichment. They never realized they were operating on a board where I controlled every single piece. The satisfaction settling over me was not born of petty vengeance. It was the profound equilibrium of a balanced ledger. Every debt incurred by their arrogance had been collected with interest. The rent was finally paid in full. I picked up my secure phone from the center console. My inbox contained a dozen new acquisition proposals from my directors, fresh opportunities to assess new structures, to evaluate new leverage points. The business of empire building never truly stops. I locked the screen and let the phone rest on my lap. The city blurred past the window, a grid of endless transactions and hidden contracts. I closed my eyes, enjoying the quiet ride. The fundamental truth of modern commercial warfare is that true victory does not involve physical destruction. Eradicating an adversary leaves a vacuum. The ultimate execution requires a far more sophisticated strategy. Defeating an enemy means dismantling their throne, seizing their crown, and forcing them to serve the very empire you built from their ashes. You do not conquer a kingdom by shouting in the streets or throwing tantrums at family dinners. You conquer it by operating silently, tracking the liabilities, and allowing your opponents to hang themselves with their own unchecked greed. True freedom and enduring authority belong exclusively to those who know how to hide in the shadows, waiting patiently to strike only when the contract is signed. The smooth ride back to my penthouse offered a moment of stark clarity. Watching the city lights reflect against the tinted glass of my vehicle, I realized the profound shift that had occurred over the last 2 years. The transition from a dismissed tenant to the undisputed owner of Apex Tower was not a product of luck. It was the result of recognizing the fundamental vulnerabilities in the people who believed they owned the world. Looking back at the wreckage of the Sterling family and the shattered remnants of my own toxic relatives, I extracted 3 vital principles from the corporate battlefield. First, people routinely confuse volume with actual power. Julian and Marcus drove leased luxury vehicles, wore custom clothing, and utilized loud intimidation to control every room they entered. They firmly believed their fabricated image made them untouchable. They failed to understand that genuine authority is entirely silent. It resides in the fine print of a commercial lease, in the hidden routing numbers of an escrow account, and in the disciplined patience required to let a fool sign his own execution order. Arrogance is nothing but a high-interest loan, and the market always eventually collects. Second, emotional reactions are a severe tactical disadvantage. When Julian mocked my lifestyle on that rooftop, and when Vanessa threw a glass of wine at my chest, the basic human instinct was to lash out and defend my pride. but shouting simply reveals your position to the enemy. I chose to swallow my pride retreat into the digital shadows and construct a flawless legal snare. Never interrupt a greedy adversary who is busy undermining their own foundation. Let them dig the hole deep enough so they can never climb out. Third, the most dangerous liabilities often share your bloodline. Society conditions us to forgive profound betrayal simply because of biological connections. Marcus and my sister willingly risked my mother's retirement funds for a fleeting chance to attend elite country club dinners. Blood does not grant anyone a free pass to exploit your stability. If your relatives operate like parasites, draining your resources while offering only disrespect in return, you owe them zero loyalty. Evicting them from your life is not a cruel act. It is a necessary measure of self-preservation. My personal ledger is now perfectly balanced. The empire I built is optimized, clean, and entirely free of toxic debts. If you are currently keeping your head down while arrogant individuals try to diminish your worth, remember that the ultimate response is never a raised voice. It is a legally binding contract. Have you ever utilized patience and strategy to systematically dismantle the false reality of a toxic person in your life? Share your own experiences of setting ironclad boundaries in the comments below. If my journey to total financial independence resonated with you, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to Rabbit Revenge for more true stories of calculated justice. Secure your assets, read the fine print, and never let anyone